This is another response to the DoNotDogfeck challenge. I'm not going to go into the introduction about why this video exists again, but just the challenge basically is how to explain why people carry out acts of sexual aggression, sometimes against dogs, but unfortunately sometimes against one another. And I'm looking for explanations which don't rely on genetics, or at least don't rely solely on genetics and evolutionary psychology. And I've been through a few of those already. Yeah, I've been thinking since yesterday really about something that TJ was talking about on TJ Does Life, which is the notion of pseudo speciation. And I hadn't come across that term before, so I'm very grateful that TJ kind of brought it to my attention, so I've done a little bit of reading about that. Pseudo speciation is when you identify a subset of the human species and characterize them as less than human or perhaps different to humans, and once you do that it allows you to treat them in different ways. And the paradigmatic example, which TJ rightly pointed out, is soldiers during the First World War. And the story goes, and as I think I've mentioned in a different video, the story goes that many soldiers in the First World War, particularly in the early phases of the war, were reluctant to shoot the enemy. Because once you had an enemy in their sights, actually pulling the trigger was very difficult, because you're looking down the barrel of your gun towards a fellow human being. And it is just very difficult. And anybody who's been in a violent situation, well, any kind of situation of conflict, and have been tempted to just throw a fist at someone's face, well, know that it's much more tricky than it looks on the movies. It's very hard to suppress the empathy and suppress just the fellow feeling that you get from another person, even if you don't like that person, even if everything kind of logical and rational about the situation would seem to demand a violent response. It's still quite difficult a lot of the time. So these soldiers in the First World War were firing over the heads of the Germans, and presumably the Germans were firing over the heads of the English or whoever. How does that, as a military leader, what do you do with that? And there is the idea is that you invoke pseudo speciation, which means that you do everything you can through propaganda, through storytelling, through myth making, to characterize the opposition as not of your species. Because presumably the reason why you're not shooting at someone, or the reason why you're reluctant to shooting someone, is because you recognize them as similar to yourself. You recognize that it's your cousin over there, or your distant cousin, but still a cousin. You recognize that you're shooting one of your own, even though politically they're not. In a sort of pure species level, of course they are. And so the idea is that you reduce them to, or change their status to approximating another species, a pseudo species, not a real another species, but something like another species. And in the First World War, that was done through all kinds of propaganda. The newspapers at the time were full of stories about the filthy Hun, and kind of caricature pictures of what it meant to be a German, in a way that portrayed them as completely different in every way to British and Allied forces. And once that process is underway, and you've got it into the heads of the soldiers that they are not looking down the barrel of a rifle at someone who is of their species, then it becomes much easier to shoot them, because you're effectively shooting an animal of some kind. Okay, so is there a way of relating that to this thing about the DoNotDogfeck challenge? Well, I mean, certainly we do all kinds of other things with dogs. I mean, if the challenge here, just to remind ourselves, if the challenge here is to give an account of why people would have sex with a dog, and then I'll move on to something else, then people do all kinds of things with dogs. I mean, obviously we do all kinds of things with other animals, and if you've ever been to a slaughterhouse, you'll know what kinds of things people are capable of doing to animals. I've spent a little bit of time in slaughterhouses and places where chickens are killed and processed industrially, and it is quite amazing. And any kind of empathy at all in those places would be completely inappropriate. And it probably sounds mad to anybody watching this video to think about empathising with animals. But we do eat animals routinely. I don't, but most other people eat animals routinely, and don't really care about how they're killed and processed. But they are killed in pretty awful ways. And if you're if you step outside the industrial abattoir system to look at something like how halal meat is produced, which is a much more kind of ritualistic slaughtering process in which the animal has to bleed to death, we are dealing with sentient, feeling creatures in a way which is a little bit odd, really, which is, it's not pseudo-speciation, it's complete speciation. But with that speciation comes, the lowering of the gun sight and the accompanying, what I think absolutely is cruelty, and a kind of objectification which that cruelty demands. So when you're, we are capable of killing animals on an industrial scale. We are capable quite easily of torturing animals in laboratories. And again, I'm not making an argument against this. I'm just pointing it out. The reason why cosmetics exists on the shelves of our supermarkets is because those cosmetics have been dropped into the eyes of thousands of rabbits until they've gone blind, or until 50% of them have died to establish LD50 figures. We are very, very, very tolerant of that kind of action towards another species. So it doesn't seem, given that, it doesn't seem that illogical to use an animal as a sexual object. If we use them as a food object, we use them as a laboratory object, we use them as objects for clothing purposes, we use them as objects to make shoes, we use them as objects to entertain us. It seems like a very small step indeed to use an object as a sexual object. I mean, obviously it's against the law, but so lots of things are against the law, and people do them anyway. So I'm not arguing for its rightness, of course. All I'm saying is that it isn't. Why is that such a challenge? It isn't such a great leap. Yeah, of course, any kind of pseudo-speciation is worth tacking on to the end of this. Anything that reduces another human being to the same kind of status, any act of pseudo-speciation on another member of the human race, would probably have a similar kind of effect. So if we're talking about if we're talking about women, for example, if through other kinds of processes we turn women into a pseudo-species, if we perhaps constantly refer to them as bitches, for example, that might be an indication of that. Or if we, if we use objective type language, object language, that would have the subtle effect of lowering our gun sights a little bit, so we're not firing over the heads of those women, but we are absolutely going for those women's jugulars. That doesn't seem too much of a stretch, I think, either, really. Yeah.